Good evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture number 8 of this 15 days online lecture series on history of ideas. Today we have Dr. Samipendra Banerjee, who is presently an assistant professor at the Department of English, University of Bongo in West Bengal, and has been teaching English literature at the postgraduate level for over 15 years. He has completed his MPhil from Jadavpur University and PhD from Vishwabharati Shantiniketan on historiography and politics of post-independent Indian English drama. He is an active member of the theatre community of Malda in West Bengal and leads the drama club of University of Bongo and acts as well as directs plays with his students, some of which are Brecht's Galileo and Shantras Soptok, an adaptation of Karl Churchill's Seven Jewish Children in 2018-19. He has received an international travel grant to present his research paper at IFTR conference in the year in Sao Paulo in Brazil in 2017. And in 2019, he has completed a prestigious course from the NSD New Delhi, that is National School of Drama. Besides, he has to his credit a plethora of papers published in various national and international journals. He is also on the editorial board of several peer-reviewed journals. His areas of interest are modern English theatre, women in 19th century Bengali theatre, and gender studies. Today he'll be talking on conceptualizing humanity, the French Revolution, and the American War of Independence. He had been as a invited speaker in our previous series, and I'm sure some of y'all who know him or who have heard him in the past know the scholarship of our honorable guest today. Besides, those who don't know, I can assure him on his behalf, I can assure you all that we are here for a cerebral feast. On behalf of Team Dark Voyage and my co-organizer, Dr. Basudhara Roy, I welcome you, Dr. Samipendra. The platform is all yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Shoykot Banerjee, for once again for this generous introduction. First of all, yes, I mean, when you were speaking, there was some kind of an echo. I hope this is okay now.
And yeah, I'm now. Yeah.
Maybe because you are using two devices, if you are using another device for the PowerPoint, maybe that is causing a problem. Anyway, yeah. So very good evening to all of you, to the esteemed participants here, and wishing you a very happy new year, of course. It's 2021 finally. And earlier in another, as Dr. Banerjee just mentioned, I had the good fortune of speaking to this audience or a similar audience in a Dark Voyage lecture series earlier, which was primarily on post-colonial drama. But this time, I have been invited for speaking on this topic on conceptualizing humanity, the French Revolution and the American War of Independence. So this is really a moment of privilege for me to be able to speak here in front of such a wonderful audience. I've got some kind of an idea already with the messages that have come in. And I also, I must mention that this course that you are thinking of in terms of a very broad-based approach of the history of ideas, it is not only interdisciplinary in nature, but it also, what should I say, equips us with certain key concepts in the history of the world and the history of ideas as such. So a little slice of which we will be looking at today. So my title, as you can see, is about, I mean, it is again an uphill task actually, because, and I am not very sure whether I will be able to do justice to both the keywords that are here, the movements actually that are here. And I would also say that as a form of apology in the beginning, it would be lesser of the American War of Independence and more of the French Revolution today. But then, as I will try to show here, both these movements are fed by a common thought, common political philosophy that dominated the world during that time. So, okay, we can start then. And my first slide is on is in the form of an introduction from, of course, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, a landmark work, as we all know. And in the first chapter of War and Peace, Pierre Bezukhov begins with these lines: "The revolution was a grand thing." And then somebody says, "Robbery, murder, and regicide." No, we stay with the first slide. "Robbery, murder, and regicide," interjected an ironical voice, to which Bezukhov replies, "Those were extremes, no doubt, but they are not what is most important. What is important are the rights of man, emancipation from prejudices, and quality of citizenship." So I would say that these are wonderful lines that would help us to identify the premise of the French Revolution as such, and not only the French Revolution, but also the American War of Independence taken together. So what we will try to do here in the course of this brief lecture is to look at the preliminaries of the factors, the causes, the effects leading on to the French Revolution, and the ways in which it had instigated, it has led on to a certain pattern of thought in transforming human minds to a great extent. Yes. Another aspect that in the next slide I have spoken of is a question that Peter McPhee puts in his book, The French Revolution. Was the French Revolution a major turning point in French, even world history, as its proponents claim, or a protracted period of violent upheaval and warfare which wrecked millions of lives? Now, if you look at the historiography on the French Revolution, what we come across basically is a duality, a set of paradoxes in terms of how do we approach the French Revolution. Do we look at it as something that unleashed the reign of terror, as a form of anarchy, or as something that brought into or conceptualized what we understand as humanity today in the form of democracy, in the form of liberalism? So which perspectives should we take? Now, again, to as all of us might be knowing, I mean, there is no simple answer to this, but in the course of the next few slides that we will go through, we will try to understand the French Revolution from both these perspectives and of course see how both these paradoxical, conflicting positions actually, in a way, sum up, or in a way, identify the major premises of a later world. What most critics or historians always have always agreed to is that the French Revolution marked a paradigm shift. The French Revolution is a line that we can draw between an older order and a new order that was, coming up, that was emerging, and it had to take some violence in the wake of it, of course. Yes, we can move on to the next one. This is where I start. I have used a lot of images, I would say, because the French Revolution is a lot about imagery, is a lot about symbolism. So I will also try to talk from those perspectives as well. Now, this is a classical image of liberty as such. As you can see, the title is "Liberty Leading the People," a famous painting by Eugene Delacroix. But interestingly, we must not confuse this with the French Revolution that we are talking of 1789, but it was the July Revolution, which is often referred to as the Second Revolution, that took place in 1830. But this painting can be seen as a symbol of the French approach towards liberty, and it has also been seen as a representative of an ongoing French Revolution as such, because the other question, the other debate underlying the different perspectives on the French Revolution is to whether the French Revolution has ended at all. I mean, when did it end at all? Because there have been several commentators who seemed to say that, okay, the French Revolution is over now, maybe in 1792, maybe in 1794, but it didn't actually come to an end so soon, and it has been an ongoing process. Now, again, as I told you, let us start with the basics. And since this is a course, so I would, in the course of my talk, of course, I will be problematizing the notions regarding what we understand by the conceptualizing of humanity as such. But at the same time, we need to take a look at the basics, even if we all know certain basic informations regarding the French Revolution. So I'll start with the causes, the factors that led on to the French Revolution. And for that, we need to go back to the 18th century, of course, to the beginning of the 18th century. I mean, it all starts way back, actually. Still, we have to start with some kind of a relevant position within the 18th century. So I would prefer to begin by talking of how France was waging different wars. In the next slide, basically, I start talking of how France was at war. And if you look at simply the Anglo-French wars in the 18th century, then there are too many. And not only, in fact, as far as Britain is concerned or England is concerned, there has been a long history of battles between the English and the French, starting from the medieval periods. And this goes on into the 18th century. My focus here is not all those wars, because there are several of such wars, but I have deliberately spoken of those wars that concerned India, particularly the possession of India. We all know that the British stronghold of India was a result of the defeat of the French in the hands of the English armies in the decisive Third Carnatic War, basically, which sealed French hopes of colonial expansion in India. And from that time onwards, it was the British who were dominating proceedings in India, and France was relegated to very small corners in India. So the first Carnatic War, 1746 to 48. So it was a series of wars, as you can see. In the first Carnatic War, basically, it was Lord Clive was a soldier, and it was Lord Clive's first war, and Lord Clive continued up till the third Carnatic War. Now, this again was coinciding with the 7 Years' War in Europe and North America. One interesting thing was that when the first Carnatic War began, actually, there were the relations on a continental front between England and France was declining already. But this did not affect the situation in India, and much to the contrast of our perceptions, England, at least, I mean, the colonial officers here in India of England and France had a very good relation amongst themselves, and they were having a nice time while England and France were in war. But however, that situation soon changed as France, gathered their naval fleets back from Mauritius and all sorts of far-off places, and the situation of war. And of course, in all these Carnatic Wars, the involvement of Indian Nawabs and Indian kings was also very much there. Ultimately, the result, we all know, this was something that happened in 1763, which was the Treaty of Paris. Yes, we can move on to the next one. The next slide is actually a photo, an image of the situation in Pondicherry, where the English forces had basically massacred Pondicherry. So this depicts the kind of damages that the French army was constantly going through in all these wars. And in the next few slides, I have spoken of this in a greater detail, in even outside India, of course. In the Mediterranean and the Atlantic seas, what happened was that the British destroyed both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean fleets. Yes, the next slide, we can move on to the next slide. And yes, they also drove French power out of India and North America as well. The trade of the French Caribbean was damaged quite a lot. So the Peace of Paris Treaty that was signed, there France made no European gains. And not only that, they lost, moreover, they lost Canada. And most of our establishments in India, as we all know, later on, Pondicherry and Chandanagar were returned to France, although the trading rights and the kind of the managerial rights to trade remained to the British. And as an aftermath of participating in all these wars, debts were constantly rising. We all know that the situation before few decades before the French Revolution was worsening in France, primarily because of France's defeats at different wars. And not only defeats, but also France's participation in different wars, which directly did not involve France, actually. So this would be one of the other factors we will take a look at. Yes, we can move on to the next one. Of course, this arch rivalry with England made France always await revenge, and they got that when the American colonists. This is where actually the French Revolution, the American War of Independence are closely intertwined with each other in terms of intellectual heritage, in terms of military history as well. So the American colonists declared war against the British, and Louis XVI then, of course, went to war, although Louis XVI knew very well that he could not afford another war at that particular moment. But, it was his pride to answer the British. And in 1778, they joined America. When British forces surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the victory was more French than American. So this was one taste of success that the French armies got, which restored their pride to a certain extent. Unfortunately, as I have pointed out here, this did not mean any material gains as such in terms of land, in terms of trade, because British trade with America, that is, continued despite Britain's withdrawal from America as a colonial force. This led on to massive loans once again, a deep financial crisis, and debts of over 3 billion livres. And this livre is the currency that was there, but it was discontinued later, up to in the later half of the 18th century. So these were huge debts, basically, that was still on. Now, so one of the reasons of a poor economy, of a bad shape, was France being at war. Yes. Then we move on to the government, of course, the form of government, which, as all of us know, is referred to as the ancient regime, or the old regime, or the old rule, or the old form of rule. Now, this ancient regime, or this old form of rule, of course, this is the image of Louis XVI, who was the emperor of France when just before the French Revolution, and Louis XVI was one of the kings who was executed in the French Revolution. Not one of the kings, I mean the king, basically, who was executed during the French Revolution, who was guillotined. Part of this problem with the ancient regime was that this was an absolute monarchy. Now, what kind of regime was it, basically? This was an absolute monarchy, and state affairs were private affairs of the king. Louis XVI managed all the state affairs on his own. Now, this is also where he was different from the previous French monarchs, because although the king always had certain rights, certain privileges, earlier kings had a custom, had a tradition of consulting with his body of ministers, which Louis XVI never did, basically. And he thought he understood finance, he thought he understood stately affairs, and he went on taking decisions, and he was answerable to none but God. This was the perception that the ancient regime put forward. An interesting anecdote here is, we all know, we will talk more of that. Louis XVI got married to Mary Antoinette in 1770. And in the celebrations that followed, it led on to a stampede, basically, where about over 130 people died. But this did not, for even a moment, stop the festivities and the celebrations that were going on at Versailles. See, these little things had gradually made the common people go against the newly married couple. So, and on the other hand, yes, in the next image, basically we are introducing Mary Antoinette, the Queen of France. This is, although this is a portrait that was done before her marriage, actually, this was the portrait drawn by Dauphin, which was sent to Louis XVI as part of the marriage proposal. Now, the king's residence, which was at Versailles, this was the most imposing physical statement of power in the 18th century France. And we will return to the Palace of Versailles later on. Actually, the Palace of Versailles and the gardens surrounding it, there were architectural marvels where Marie Antoinette would move around and would relax herself, basically. Yes. So apart from that, taxation was another factor. We all have some kind of an idea about that, that there were erratic taxation rules. And there were three kinds of taxes, basically, or taxation systems, basically. One was the tile, the major direct tax, the tithe, which was the tax extracted by the church, and the gabelle on salt, which was a major indirect tax. Now, the problem was that these all three kinds of taxations were applicable only to the third estate. Now, this So before moving on, I must explain that the ancient France, or I mean, France at that particular time was divided into the three estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The first estate, which was also a kind of a social distinction, a social uh, description or distinction of classes. Whereas the first estate comprised of the clergy and the people from the church, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was all other people. So naturally, the third estate was, in terms of population, in terms of numbers, they were greater number of people, but they were, of course, the poorer sections of the society. And the entire burden of taxation went on to the third estate, right? Now, Alwyn Houghton, as you can see here, has described bands of ostensibly pregnant women smuggling salt from Brittany. Brittany is the western part of France, which was the lowest taxed area, and eastwards into areas of high taxation in order to profit from clandestine sales of this necessity. What is implied is that there was the taxation rules, as I have pointed out in the first point, was absolutely erratic, and the taxes of salt on salt, for example, varied from one place to another, and there was no proper standard that was there in terms of these taxation rules. It was absolutely arbitrary, and as I told and already discussed, that the entire burden of this taxation was on the poorer people. Now, this will gradually lead on to what is often referred to as the subsistence crisis, which I have spoken of in the next slide. The subsistence crisis basically comes up when there was a huge increase in population. If we look at the population of France from 1715 onwards to this particular time in the 1770s, there was a huge growth in population, a rural population primarily, which led on to a rising demand for food grains, which was not met with. And there was, whenever there was drought and other factors, environmental factors stepped in, there was a lack of supply. And so this led on to extensive poverty. Now, this, of course, this is something that happens, and that is true for every nation. But for France, this had been happening for quite some time. And the gap between the rich and the poor was increasing more and more. And this is what leads on to what we refer to as subsistence crisis, when the peasants devote all their energies towards gathering food grains instead of anything else, basically, in this situation. So, as historians point out, the subsistence crisis is one of the major reasons. So basically, we can see that on the one hand, the dwindling economy and financial condition of France, and on the other, the social organization of the governmental policies of the ancient regime leading on to the subsistence crisis were the key reasons of a volatile situation in France. Now, of course, there were other factors that were involved because of the unruly, the very arbitrary taxation rules also, because the resources were there with the nobility, the resources were there with the kings, because they were leading a lavish lifestyle, no doubt. But then the entire burden of these wars and battles and the huge debts were always on the third estate, were always on the poor laborers and the peasants. Now, I will quickly move on to the events of 1789 in the next slide, where see, this year had been a remarkable year for France, not just because of the French Revolution, but for the rapidity with which different events took place one after the other. Now, the king had, of course, understood that the situation is going out of control. And finally, the king consented to convene a meeting of the Estates General. Now, what was this Estates General? This was a meeting involving all the three estates, that is, representatives from all the three estates. Now, ironically, although the third estate was, had most number of people, their representation understandably was the lowest, whereas the first two estates had greater representation. And another interesting fact is that the last time the Estates General had met, I mean, such a meeting of the Estates General was held last time in 1614. In 1614, it had not met ever since. So this was a very special situation, and the entire nation was preparing for the meeting at the Estates General. And the third estate was invited here, and the already, angry third estate wanted a scope to speak out here. But ultimately, in the meeting, the third estate was significantly dishonored. Actually, in the 1614 meeting, the rule was that if there had to be a voting, then each estate would have one vote. So one vote from the first estate, one vote from the second estate, and one vote from the third estate. Understandably, the first two estates were closer to each other in terms of position, in terms of the privileges they enjoyed. And there was always a chance of voting out the third estate by 2:1. What the third estate now wanted was that the vote should not be held like that. The vote should be held in terms of one representative is equal to one vote. So all these debates ensued, but even then the third estate was falling short in terms of numbers, basically, in terms of representatives. Agassiz, one of the founding fathers of the initial phase of the movement, in a pamphlet, actually, he wrote, "What is the third estate?" And he answered in this way, very interestingly, everything. What has it been until now in the public order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. Now, the third estate, although I have said that it was distinct from the nobility and the churches, the third estate was not a homogeneous group, because the third estate consisted of people from all walks of life who were not either nobility or the clergy. So it was actually a very heterogeneous group involving tradesmen, very rich tradesmen. One of the reasons why the third estate began to be influential in French politics in terms of French affairs was that it had merchants, it had tradesmen and intellectuals and people who were educated, lawyers, etc., in the third estate. So they were, again, the first tier of the third estate, whereas the peasants and other laborers were at the lowest rungs. Again, interestingly, in the Estates General meeting, the lower ranked peasants and laborers were not even allowed any entry. They had to wait outside. Only the lawyers and the tradesmen and the merchants could enter. Anyway, so already the certain steps were taken up. Then the formation of the National Assembly is one such event that took place. And this was closely followed by, in the next slide, I have shown the image of the tennis court oath, actually, very famous event in the history of France and the French Revolution, where General Bailly was leading this tennis court oath. This is the National Assembly. They met in a tennis court and decided to take this resolution, which they have noted as their unshakable resolution, never to separate until the Constitution is established. So already the third estate was pushing forth towards a major form of reform, a major form of transformation in French politics, and wanted to remove or do away with the ancient regime. But this is interesting, just keep this in mind, that they had, their oath was never to separate until the constitution is established. Once the constitution is established, the task of the National Assembly is over. The new government will take over from there. And they actually did that. They kept their word, although they were very disorganized initially, like many other revolutionary forms. But then they came together and they went on to establish the draft, the constitution. Yes. So other events of 1789 were equally significant. In the next slide, I have spoken of Louis XVI dismissing Jacques Necker. Yeah, so Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker as one non-noble minister. Jacques Necker was sympathetic to the cause of the third estate. Actually, he was also seen in the gatherings of the third estate, and Jacques Necker had tried to convince the Louis XVI that no, I mean, we should take into consideration the third estate, which is growing in terms of power, in terms of political opinion. But it was a defiant action of Louis XVI that he dismissed Jacques Necker, and that proved to be. There are actually many such spots which can be identified as the final spark that led on to the revolution. And there was also news that 20,000 mercenaries had gathered in Paris. Louis XVI then was using mercenary soldiers. This is again interesting. He was borrowing soldiers from Switzerland, from Prussia, from Austria, and places like that. And it was believed that those mercenaries would have little qualms, would have little doubts about slaughtering a Parisian crowd compared to French soldiers as such, because there was already a rising public opinion in favor of the third estate, in favor of the revolutionaries, if we may call them so, by that time. This was further problematized by the very famous escalation in the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread. It became more than double, actually. And this was because of the deliberate withholding of supplies by the noble landowners, okay, who did not, who wanted to trouble the poor people. There are several, the iconography that is associated with the times around the French Revolution that repeatedly talks of these, this huge distinction in terms of rank, in terms of class, between the nobility, between the first two estates and the third estate. And therefore, it needed a revolution to settle the scores. Yes, in the next slide, I continue with this, again, a very famous image of the storming of the Bastille. It all happened in July 14 July 1789, that, some Parisian people, it is some accounts say that it was spontaneous, and they stormed the Bastille in search of the arms that were supposed to be stored there in Bastille. And they swarmed the Bastille, and it was devastated. Later on, even pieces of the Bastille fort were sold at the markets for all those who wanted to keep a memoir, keep a copy of the fall of the Bastille. So the fall of the Bastille was quite easy. It happened right away, and the Bastille then was a prison. But on that particular day, there were only 7 prisoners. All those prisoners were released. But what is more important is how we approach Bastille, how we see Bastille in popular imagination, in popular culture. Yeah, in the next slide, we have moved on to certain images. We carry on with these images, with the iconography, and I would like to see this as a kind of symbolism of the revolution, because the revolution was largely symbolic as well. It was, yes, very much a reality, but it was also carrying a number of symbols. Now, this is a very famous painting by Nanine Verlaine, one of the rare images by a woman painter in those days. And this painting is entitled Liberty. This painting, if you closely observe, is rich in symbolism, particularly the pyramid in the background. To the revolutionaries, the triangle was an image of perfection, was an image of knowledge, was an image of all that is just. So the pyramid in the background represents the justice, represents knowledge, represents what is perfect. And of course, the red cap, and we will come back to these. The lady is holding the Declaration of the Rights of Man, to which we will again return. Now, this brings us to the next slide, which is where I have actually identified some of the political symbols of the French Revolution. These are again very popular and very commonly known symbols, but maybe many of us have forgotten these. So to start with, from the top left, the red cap basically is the Phrygian cap that even is referred to in antiquity. We first have the Phrygian cap, which is the red cap, which was worn by a person who has earned the right to be free. Next, clockwise after that is the broken chain, a symbol of course, the chains were symbols of fetters, the chains were symbols of slavery and dependence, and broken chains symbolized freedom. Next is the fasces, or the rods. These rods are tied together, and interestingly tied together by the tricolor. No, I mean back to the earlier, yeah. So the tricolor is, these rods symbolize unity and strength. We all know that story regarding the tired bundle, which cannot be broken. So it also symbolizes that. And this is the snake eating its own tail, forming a ring. And this is again one of the common symbols of eternity, which the French Revolution and the ideals that it was standing for. And this is the eye, all-seeing eye within the trident, within the triangle, as a symbol of knowledge, as a symbol of radiance. Okay, so all these, there are other symbols as well, the tablet, the winged woman. So one of the reasons why these, I believe this iconography was in so circulation across France during those days was that the popularity of these images and symbols could reach out to the illiterate masses better than words would, because many of the people did not yet know how to read and write. So these symbols, these images, appealed to their imagination, and they joined each other hand in hand and worked towards freedom. Yes, in the next slide, again, I move on to the most, what should I say, the strongest symbols. I can look at it as the strongest symbols of the French Revolution, or the guillotine, which is also an introduction to the inauguration of the Reign of Terror that the guillotine introduced. So we all are aware of the guillotine as an instrument of punishment. And what is interesting here is that the spectacle that the event of the guillotine offered during the Reign of Terror, nobles were caught and brought after some kind of a trial, and they were guillotined one after the other. Okay, so, and there's a performative possibility that we can see here in the whole act of staging this guillotine, which may be discussed here. Yes. Next, we move on to images, two images of Marie Antoinette. This is the right one, is the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. Jacques-Louis David had been doing several sketches and paintings associated with these guillotining. The left is probably a shot from a BBC documentary, but what I found interesting here is the way the heads are structured. Mary Antoinette raising her head and the guard accompanying her, shaking his head down in a mark of some kind of a respect or a kind of a regret, maybe. On the other hand, this is Mary Antoinette on the right side. We can see that her hands are tied behind and she's being taken on her way to execution. Now, actually, this brings us to Mary Antoinette, and even if it is a little digression, I would like to talk about it. And which is why in the next slide, I have spoken of Mary Antoinette. And we all know about this very famous utterance, they don't have bread. Why don't they eat cake? This is, of course, a translation, and it has been variously translated as if they don't have bread, let them eat cake, which is one of the most infamous comments ever in world history, probably, which is allotted to Mary Antoinette. So how, of course, we are, aghast at the way this comment, a queen of France at the height of a financial crisis, poverty everywhere, how could a queen have uttered such words? If they do not have bread, why don't they eat cake? I mean, was she really so far detached from the common life of the commoners? Well, this is, I mean, of course, many of us know this by this time, but recent historians have questioned the claim of this comment to Mary Antoinette. Part of this is the biography, not recent, but it's 2001 biography by Antonia Fraser, Mary Antoinette, The Journey, where she claims that this comment was never uttered by Mary Antoinette, and it has been entirely wrongly attributed to Mary Antoinette. And of course, this later Kirsten Dunst film directed by Sofia Coppola, Mary Antoinette, again, which was inspired by Antonia Fraser's book. This film came out in 2006 and is regarded as, so both these works of fiction, works of in the film, are regarded as sympathetic presentations of Mary Antoinette in a later strain. Okay, so often what happens is that we need to find out a villain more often than not, and in that case, probably Mary Antoinette was that. Yes, in the next slide, actually, I have moved on further with that. And this is what Antonia Fraser says in her epilogue, that a scapegoat was in fact what Mary Antoinette became, among other things. She would be blamed for the whole French Revolution by those who optimistically looked to one guilty individual as a way of explaining the complex horrors of the past. And recent feminist critics also questioned the sexualization and demonization of Mary Antoinette, which was part of popular activity then. Right, so this was just a kind of a digression, and we can now move back to the course of the French Revolution, the course that it was taking. The National Assembly, yes, in the next slide I have spoken of. The National Assembly became now the National Constituent Assembly, and it came up with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizens, which was published in August 1789, a landmark text during those days. The influence, of course, was the American Declaration of Independence, which had occurred just before, remember, in 1776, to which we will occasionally return. And of course, the political philosophy of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had always preached this whole idea of democracy, of the rights, the natural rights, the inalienable rights of man. And this is reflected in the declaration that the French Constituent Assembly drafted. And the first article, actually, it was in the form of several articles. And the first article stated that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good. Popular sovereignty, therefore, replaces the divine right of kings. So France is moving towards becoming a republic, which happens in 1792. And very soon after, of course, King Louis XVI and Mary Antoinette are guillotined. The declaration also mentions briefly the active and passive citizens, to which I shall come back later when I bring back the question of the woman. I mean, I will end this discussion by referring back to women and how women were part of the revolution, or whether they were at all seen as a part or a party to the revolution. So I'll come back to the question of citizenship then. Now, of course, this was the words that were being said were ushering in a new world. There is no doubt about it. It was conceptualizing humanity in a new way, in emphasizing freedom, in talking of, I haven't really mentioned the three most important words associated with the French Revolution, which we all know: liberty, equality, and fraternity. But these principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity had a very textual and a very symbolic nature as well. And its textuality and its symbolism I have briefly discussed, but it was not possible without the act of Enlightenment philosophers. And this is where I would like to focus on in the next slide. I have shown some images again of the Enlightenment philosophers. From top left, if we start, then that is John Locke. Then comes Voltaire, of course, not in orders of seniority, but somewhat like that. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the most important and most influential figures of the Enlightenment, and of course the founding fathers of the French Revolution. And of course the last, the bottom left image is that of Sir Isaac Newton. Yes. So we will now focus briefly on the ideas or ideals and notions of Rousseau and John Locke. And so in his 1680 work, Second Treatise on Government, John Locke contended, in the next slide, I have spoken of that all men are born equal with inalienable natural rights that governments cannot purport to take away. So what is important for us to understand is that even in the second point, and he condemned slavery as vile and miserable, although there was a problem with John Locke. One of the most important problems was that John Locke himself had invested in a corporation dealing with slavery, while speaking outright against slavery. Anyway, what was important was that the ideals from the end of the more or less after the Restoration onwards, or following the glorious revolution in England, people like John Locke and later on Rousseau and Voltaire would start imagining in terms of, in literary terms, in terms of theorizing or philosophizing about the notions of liberty and freedom, about the ways in which people cannot be ruled arbitrarily by the monarchs. So a challenge to the divine right of kings was already at work. And you see, the next is, of course, Rousseau, much more popular than Locke in terms of his impact on the French Revolution. Rousseau, of course, was very attacked Christianity very much. He saw Christianity as the most violent of earthly despotism, even though it instills respect for the law and a devotion to the state. So in free societies, people enter freely into a social contract. This is Rousseau's idea of the social contract, a contract between the state and the people, but a contract that is not out of force, that is not made out of force. So that, I mean, for the common good, to realize their full potential as rational and moral beings. And of course, the voluntary notion was also there behind the social contract, as Rousseau has, of course, pointed out. And also interestingly, that in Rousseau's terminology, or in Rousseau's idea, there was no force or discrimination involved in this social contract. If it is, then the social contract breaks down. So Rousseau is perceiving society in the form of a social contract. Now, you see, none of these are very dramatic or very unknown to us today, but during the times when Rousseau and Locke and Voltaire were writing, these ideas were significantly radical. And this had material to lead on people towards revolutionary action. And that is what happened, particularly in the case of the French Revolution. For example, Locke and Rousseau in particular were read across England, across France. And at the time of the French Revolution, Rousseau was one of the most read authors. And the intellectuals, the rising middle class actually, who knew how to read and write, they actually read out pieces from Social Contract and other works by Rousseau and Locke and Voltaire to the people out there. And this is how the influence went on. Now, this also would lead to, if we move on towards a greater idea of how humanity is conceptualized, because the French Revolution was never, why do we need to discuss French Revolution at all? Because the French Revolution was not a French affair. Very interestingly, the French Revolution had a global impact, and therein lies its importance. So in the next slide, again, as a literature person, my emphasis has been slightly inclined towards literary texts, but we all know of Wordsworth and Wordsworth's very famous words. Yes, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Right? So Wordsworth saw the revolution from the very beginning. He was young, and it was blissful to be alive in that dawn. But we all know that Wordsworth went on to live quite some time by the standard of romantic poets in general. And again, there was disillusionment that had set in. Henry Fuseli was a dynamic painter who was also in London then. For Henry Fuseli, as you can see, gigantic efforts of character. And William Blake, yes, very famously, was put on a red hat and danced in the streets to celebrate the revolution. So that is how part of England, remember, part of England was responding to the revolution. And why would these people do in such a way? Because the French Revolution in Europe had ushered in hopes of a better world, hopes of a world of, with principles of liberty, liberalism, and democracy, and of course, republicanism, as distinct from the old regime. So the ancient regime is said to have existed before 1789. With 1789 onwards, it was an entirely new world altogether. And the role of the American War of Independence is also crucial in respect to that. Now, from here, we move on to another aspect of debate, actually, that ensued, which is often referred to as, in the next slide I've talked of, the pamphlet war or the revolution controversy. Now, part of this conceptualizing of humanity is the scope of debate, because the scope of debate is possible only in a liberal atmosphere, only in a world that values opinions of difference, although they attack each other, of course. So I would like to look at the whole event of the revolution controversy or the pamphlet war as a fallout, as a product that was made possible because of the French Revolution. Now, of course, if we look back, yeah, next slide, please. So the revolution controversy, the Declaration of American Independence takes place in 1776. And after that, the French Revolution, 1789, had sparked off an intellectual debate as well, a very important intellectual debate. Whereas such a revolution, or the question of liberty, or whereas such a revolution was necessary at all in a pamphlet war. Now, what was this pamphlet war all about? This we will look through in the next few slides. And now in the next slide, I have spoken of Dr. Richard Price. Dr. Richard Price's sermon on the love of country, which was presented or published in 1789, where Dr. Richard Price congratulated the French National Assembly, which I've already referred to, for the revolution had opened up new possibilities for religious and civil freedom. See, this is how Dr. Richard Price and other liberals are looking at the French Revolution as one that has opened up new possibilities for both religious and civil freedom. And the French Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen had closely followed, the next slide, had closely followed the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. Now, Price, in his article, in his pamphlet, was speaking of the being a citizen of the world, because you see, both these documents had also brought open a debate concerning citizenship, and Price was speaking of the of being a world citizen, and his doctrine of perfectibility as well, that the world can be made better through human effort. However, in the next slide, I come back to the text of the American Declaration of Independence, which is, as we all know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is similar to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, but this is very American also, because the pursuit of happiness is something that is very distinctively American, I would say, as apart from life and liberty, of course. Anyway, this sentence has been, in the next slide, I point this out, that this sentence has been known as one of the best known sentences in the English language and the most consequential and potent words in American history. So the American, which is why I was saying that that in terms of symbolism and in terms of textuality, these two revolutions, apart from their military impacts, of course, in terms of textuality, these two important events had a lot of impact. Next, we cannot do away with the philosopher Edmund Park. And in the next slide, I move over to Edmund Park, where Edmund Park basically takes up, in fact, it's very interesting to observe Edmund Park's positions here. And firstly, as part of the pamphlet war, yes, we can move on. Park writes Reflections on the Revolution in France, this very significant text here in 1790, which was regarded as an angry response basically to Price. And where Park says that replacement of the rights of kings by the rights of man is blasphemous. So Park is actually among the conservative. Not all people are impressed. Yes, it was great to have a liberal outlook, but then for a conservative like Park, it was not the desired, what should I say, the course that the French Revolution had taken was not at all welcome by Park. Can we please go to the next slide? So the replacement of rights of kings by rights of man is blasphemous and would lead to anarchy, Burke feels. Burke actually warns in his reflections on the revolution in France, Burke warns that this is going to be even worse. In 1790, Burke says that this is going to be even worse and it would need a military dictatorship to release France and entire Europe from this crisis. And Burke was right, which is why Burke almost, he had this prophetic kind of attachment to his whatever he says. Now the French, which is why Burke became very popular. So the French were seeking, another point of Burke's attack was that the French were seeking to establish what they called liberty by wholesale destruction. So if we move on to, so this is what I'm suggesting is that this is part of the revolution controversy. This is part of the pamphlet war, and the debate that ensued is because of the possibilities released by the French Revolution. Yes, in the next slide, I have basically made a list of the works that were part of the pamphlet war. There were several other pamphlets also, but these are the major ones. So in 1789 comes out Richard Price's On the Love of Country, then comes Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, then comes Wollstonecraft, who answers Burke basically in her A Vindication of the Rights of Men. Remember, this is not the more famous text. The one that is listed in number 5 is the one that is more famous, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And before that, of course, Thomas Paine's Rights of Men. So all these pamphlets were, in the last few were pro-revolutionary. And here only Burke is against the revolution and a conservative. So the point is that the revolution had ushered in a huge controversy, and several works came out as a product of from the intellectual minds of the 18th century, who went on to respond in their own ways. Now, there was an iconographic of visual representation or caricatures as well. And here in the next 2 slides, I have taken a look at 2 very famous caricatures at that point of time. And I hope my audience would also enjoy taking a look at these images. Can we? Yeah. So this is a painting by, this is called the Radical's Arms. I'm sorry about the visual quality of it. It's not very clear, but you can always search it in the net. So this is a painting by George Cruikshank, and we can all see the French flag. I mean, at least the parts of the tricolor over at the top, where it is written, no religion, no God, no religion, no king, no constitution. Okay, so this is a painting that caricatures the revolutionaries, and anybody looking at the painting would realize that this is part of the chaos, the disorder that the world was in. And this is the painting is actually deliberately targeting this. You can see that that at the center is the guillotine with blood spilling over from here, and it's absolute chaos. Things are lying low, and among the things that are lying low, you can see, if you are careful enough, that there is a Bible, that there is a cross, there are symbols of the church and symbols of monarchy, the scepter, etc. Okay, so, and of course the 2 figures, if we are close enough, we can see that the 2 figures are also erratically portrayed, exaggerated representations, indicating that the revolutionaries are nothing but robbers and thugs or things like that. So that is one perspective. Then comes in the next painting. We have, yeah, can we? Yes. In the next painting, we have, this is again a caricature by James Gilray. This is where, I mean, this is Dr. Richard Price. This is Dr. Richard Price writing his pamphlets. And the figure with a poking nose, an exaggerated figure, of course, from behind is Edmund Park. who is with the crown on one hand and the church, the cross on the other, is interfering. And this is again the title of the painting is "Smiling Out a Rat." Okay, so this is how the whole what I'm trying to suggest is that the revolution, apart from its military conflicts, apart from its reign of terror, apart from its violence that it ushered in, there was also this battle that was being fought in the intellectual arena in terms of the revolution controversy, the pamphlet war, and this iconographical this visual battles that also were being painted across. Right now, at this point we need to return to Burke actually, because Edmund Burke had been one of the crucial figures who had influenced the American Revolution. So in the next slide, I talk of Burke on the American Revolution, where basically this is part of Burke's 2 or 3 speeches, some of which were published later on. The first one on American taxation was a speech that he gave in January 1774, published January 1775, which was to repeal tea duty. And then his famous speech in the House of Commons in March 1775, where Burke identifies that the people of the colonies are descendants of Englishmen, after all. They are therefore not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. The people are Protestants, a persuasion not only favorable to liberty, but built upon it. So very strongly, Burke was suggesting the House of Commons that they should not do anything drastic in terms of in their approach towards the American colonists' revolt. The 13 colonists, the 13 colonies that had declared their independence or went on to revolt. Again, in Burke's view, the British government was fighting the American English. You see, note how Burke is identifying the American English as English, after all, our English brethren in the colonies, with a Germanic king employing the hurling sword of German boors and vassals to destroy the English liberties of the colonists. The attack was, of course, towards George III. So Burke, therefore, this is very interesting that Burke was sympathetic towards the American cause, and Burke was sympathetic about the American Revolution. And very interestingly, he was also not against the French Revolution initially, but it's only late, the kind of course that it took up later on is what where Burke disintegrated and went against the French Revolution. Another figure of importance to the American Revolution, of course, is Thomas Paine. And in the next slide, I have spoken of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, again, that was Common Sense. It's very interesting to see. I mean, actually, Common Sense was one of the most widely read pamphlets of the American Revolution. We can see it as a clarion call for unity against the corrupt British court so as to realize America's providential role in providing an asylum for liberty. Written in a direct and lively style, it denounced the decaying despotisms of Europe and pilloried hereditary monarchy as an absurdity. At a time when many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, Common Sense demonstrated to many the inevitability of separation. So in a way, the pamphlet Common Sense, which was very popular and was circulated widely across America, was one of the important documents that sparked off the American Revolution as well. And also, you see, this is where the connections are so evident and so vital that on the one hand is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was also at London. Thomas Paine is actually born English, but an American. And he was in London. He was very much a strong part of the London liberals and dissenters that included Henry Fuseli, that I just mentioned, William Blake, William Godwin, and of course, Mary Wollstonecraft later on. So Thomas Paine's ideas, so these ideas were were intercontinental ideas that were constantly being exchanged. And as far as the American Revolution is concerned, the influence of the European, the Enlightenment figures was very central and very much a part of it. Now, so after this, I move towards some kind of a gradual conclusion by raising this very important question, I would say, in connection with the French Revolution. And important in the sense that we often forget this little part. Did women have a revolution? And it is actually recent, once again, recent readings of the French Revolution have tried to see how women were part of it, whether they were part of it at all or not. And also question, therefore, the way historiography has been operating all these years. And the accompanying image is the very famous image of the Parisian women marching towards Versailles. Versailles as the Versailles, because at that time, after the fall of Bastille, the Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were in Versailles. They were not in Paris. And these Parisian women, despite the best efforts of the French mercenary soldiers and the guards, they were unstoppable, and they took up whatever all arms that they had. And you can see that these arms are basically agricultural tools. And with that, they marched towards Versailles. They forced the king and the queen to return to Paris with them. Shortly after, the trials followed, and the king and the queen would be executed. So women actually undoubtedly had a very important part in the revolution. So nobody can deny that, because women were strongly a part of that. When the revolution had gathered, when the Third Estate had began to get organized, women were part of it, partly because they hoped that their lives would be changed as well. There would be changes in their lives. They would have a better living. Now, but that often wasn't possible. So that is one. And apart from this general unknown women represented in the image, we have at least two women about whom I would like to talk of. One is Olympe de Gouges, of course, in the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is Olympe de Gouges. We know about her as one of the most radical feminists, if we can use this word, during those days, French feminists. Yes, in the next slide, I talk of the contribution of Olympe de Gouges was very interesting one. And we all know that in 1791, she brought out the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. I hope you have noticed that whatever declaration so far we have been talking of has always used the word man, and it has not used the word woman at all. So the declaration, so this gender inequality was answered by Olympe de Gouges. And she asks this question: man, are you capable of being fair? A woman is asking, at least you will allow her that right? Tell me, what gave you the sovereign right to oppress my sex? So one of the major paradoxes of the French Revolution was that we spoke of liberty, we spoke of equality, of fraternity, of liberalism, of democracy, but it applied only about, that is what I'm about to tell actually, the question that just flashed across my screen. So woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. Social distinctions may only be based on common utility, is the first article of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. Now, Olympe actually went a long way by revolutionizing, by radically modeling her declaration just like the previous declaration, the very famous Declaration of the Rights of Man. Okay, and it had articles, the number of articles that it had, Olympe also prepared similar number of articles. And the first article almost as a parody of this one. And this is her fate ultimately. Olympe de Gouges, who had been a sympathizer of the French Revolution, who had been with the Jacobins at the beginning, was ultimately guillotined in 1793. So you see, this is many unresolved questions will be there. And I just move on. Why is this radical? Because let us just quickly take a look at the position of women during those days. Yes, in the next slide, I have spoken of. See, women did not have careers as such. So women were not tradesmen. They could not go to the church. I mean, they could not become part of the clergy, and nobility is, of course, by birth. So as such, women did not have careers, and women were not citizens, therefore. And this is what brings us back to the notion of active citizens and passive citizens that the Declaration of the Rights of Man had issued. See, who are the active citizens? Only French citizens above or over the age of 25, men who could pay taxes, okay, equal to the laborers' 3 days' wages. So in that sense, women, because they did not have careers, they could never pay taxes, of course, and therefore they were not active citizens. And if you are not an active citizen, if you are a passive citizen, you will not be able to pay taxes, or of course you will, of course you will not have any political role as such. So what we have is here, from here, it was a world that was hostile to women as such. And of course, as you can see, that there was no need for higher education for them. They only learned a practical training for their domestic roles. In the next slide, I speak of Sheridan. Sheridan in the Rivals, just to make the mood lighter, although this is not a light matter. Mrs. Malaprop very famously says, "Observe me, Sir Anthony, I would by no means wish a daughter of mine to be a progeny of learning. I don't think so much learning becomes a young woman. For instance, I would never let her meddle with Greek or Hebrew or algebra or simony or fluxions or paradoxes or such inflammatory branches of learning." See how there is a distinction that is being made, okay, between the male world of knowledge and the female world of knowledge. Neither would it be necessary for her to handle any of your mathematical, astronomical, diabolical instruments. By this time, thanks to Galileo and of course later on Isaac Newton and others, lots of these physical instruments were already there in popular parlance. But Sir Anthony, I would send her at 9 years old to a boarding school in order to learn a little ingenuity and artifice. So see, this, why I'm quoting this is apart from the, of course, the humor that lies here, it also reflects the position of women, the expectations from women of those days. See, this is 1775, and the French Revolution is about 10 years away from when the Rivals was written. And this is also in connection with this is my point that I would next bring in, that is actually one of the authors that is my personal favorite. My students know this, and that is Mary Wollstonecraft, whose image you can see here. And Mary Wollstonecraft's, as I told you, a vindication of the rights of woman. I won't have time to talk of this today, but I extensively deal with Wollstonecraft's writings and works. And we can see Wollstonecraft as a product of, and her ideas as a product of the French Revolution. She was a liberal, she was a dissenter from the very beginning, and she went over and stayed in France during the French Revolution. So much was she influenced, so So much was she impacted by the liberal course that it was taking, amidst personal problems also. Anyway, so, and Mary Wollstonecraft, what is interesting, I'll just mention this part about Wollstonecraft, was that much of Vindication is actually a response to Rousseau. Because if you go back to Rousseau, Rousseau is talking of equality, Rousseau is talking, but again, man is born free and is everywhere in chains, is what Rousseau begins. And everywhere he uses the word man. For Rousseau, woman does not exist, and the only role of woman is to what should I say, be a sexual companion to man when he pleases. These are the words that Rousseau uses in his Emile. And Mary Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication, answers Rousseau. And actually, the Vindication of the Rights of Woman is an afterthought after Wollstonecraft's first Vindication. This is why we say that there are these two vindications. The first vindication is the vindication of the rights of man, and the second vindication is the vindication of the rights of woman, which Wollstonecraft later on extended the rules that were applicable, the freedom that was applicable to men. Why not will they be applicable to women? The same question that Olympe de Gouges had raised. Thankfully, Wollstonecraft was not a French citizen and she was not guillotined, but she also did not have a very nice legacy, at least in the contemporary times. And the next image is again a caricature. Is a caricature by David Levine, where in that lecture also I have used some of these images, not all of these. The other woman that I would like to add and close almost is in the next slide is Charlotte Corday, another figure of vast importance. I mean, the earlier caricature was about Mary Wollstonecraft, showing her as an angry woman. We always have this tendency of belittling the feminist movement by showing feminists as angry women, angry about and angry against men, but that is not the fact, actually. We all know that now. So Charlotte Cordray was another French radical woman who assassinated Jean-Paul Marat. And this again is actually this whole thing, Jean-Paul Marat and Charlotte Corday, could be the topic of another whole discussion, another whole lecture itself. I'm not going into that, but Marat was the radical and very flashy, journalist who was writing all sorts of articles. And Charlotte Corday, on the other hand, was a Girondist, and she believed that the radical and the violent course that it had taken was primarily because of Marat. And so she assassinated Marat. And of course, I don't have to tell you that as a result, very soon she was trialed and she was guillotined again. There are very interesting, letters and writings concerning Charlotte Corday. If you're interested, you can go to that. Right. So this is my last slide with end and beginning. So what ended? What the French Revolution and, of course, the American Revolution, what they could end was despotism, aristocracy, privilege, colonial slavery. It all started off the abolitionist movements across North America and in Europe as well. And we know the debates concerning the abolitionist movement, of course. What it began democracy and liberalism, and it began freedom. So the impact of the French Revolution would be best seen as, yes, paradoxical, but one that has shown the world the value of democracy, the value of liberalism, and the value, of course, of freedom. And on this note, I would like to end. Yes, the next slide is a thanking you slide. Right. So what I have done basically is I have raised certain issues, and I hope you can take over from here if you're interested, and you can explore further some of these issues. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Shomipendra, for so captivatingly presenting an era which, from an English literature perspective, it is not, as a student, is not that much paid attention to. So yes, your photographic presentations, especially the caricatures, uh, I'm sure the participants, including the teachers as well as the students, they have definitely been benefited. How through caricatures people were mocked, and the mocking uh, was genuine. Like nowadays, if you have caricatures, we have all sorts of caricature problems. You are from West Bengal, you are quite aware of it. So
Yeah.
yes, so yes, so uh, although at the present contemporary times, caricatures are considered to be a liberation of art, but in this particular presentation, as you said, how Mary Shelley, especially Mary Wollstonecraft's
Mm.
caricature, that was not only a caricature that was made to make fun, but it was a genuine caricature of making fun of a person, not irrespective of her opinions, as well as the category, that is the gender to which she belongs.
Mm.
So this is something which is I find quite insightful. So that somehow does not go with the contemporary understanding of caricature what we understand, because we are made to understand that if somebody makes somebody else's caricature, people should not be serious about it. People
Yeah.
should have that liberality, and if you don't have that liberality, if you somehow take action, that means you are not a person who is giving space to right to freedom. But here you have presented a caricature of
Mm.
Wollstonecraft, which was genuinely caricatured to insult somebody.
I
uh,
mean, it was a personal attack.
yeah, it's
Yes.
a personal attack, both as a person as well as the gender. So,
Yeah.
so this is something I found very interesting, especially the caricatures that you have shown in this particular
Thank you.
presentation. I would like to and that the murdering, the killing of Marak, I hope.
Mm.
Yeah, so that is also something, a very interesting feature happening during this age, which can be very insightful. And truly, you have justified the objective of this online lecture series, where our objective is to infuse certain ideas into the budding minds, so that they can work on those ideas and develop their understanding of literature. And you know this lecture series, because this is the fifth of the lecture series is that we are holding right from September. This is so far we have had eight lectures, and every single lecture has been very, very fascinating from their own perspective. So as an organizer, we are very happy that our resource persons are giving us so much of importance and so much of space, understanding the fact that how expectingly we will be expecting not only us but also the participants. And thank you very much
That,
on behalf of Team Dad
that
Voyage.
we have to, of course.
Thank you very much on behalf of Team Dad Voyage. And because we know we are very demanding in our invitations. We have certain norms, and we understand that we are demanding. But if you understand the whole gamut, if you understand the whole system of our functioning is, at the end of the day, to help academia, to support academia, especially the researchers, the young students, because this will not stop here. Ultimately, this will have its own journey, which will at the end stop when this book is released somewhere in the next year. So that is where our objective will be achieved. This is half done till now. And thank you very much, Dr. Swami Pandro, for such a very interesting and insightful lecture. and putting in so many 52 slides, if I'm not wrong. Uh, Now, I would put forward few questions, if you please allow me. Uh,
Yes.
One question is that this is something we would like to hear your opinion, because you belong from a place and you can very well give an understanding of this question. You can express, we can all understand, because you can understand this question very properly. I quote the participant: notwithstanding the result bearing utility of any socio-political revolution, can we say that a revolution, in spite of its liberatory potential for the majority section of a society, is also having an inherent oppression slash exploitative edge to it for certain section, class, group of that same society?
Hmm. Uh, Difficult. Just a minute. Yes, I mean, what course that revolution would take, it is difficult to predict in the beginning. But if we go by the French Revolution, then yes, the reign of terror was unexpected. Uh, I was half expecting this, because the ideals that the French Revolution was preaching, and the kind of practice that was going through in terms of the reign of terror, that cannot be justified. But you see, it was not. I mean, it is difficult to say in those terms, because it is always a result of different and complex actions that happen at that particular sphere. Robespierre, actually, here in this case, started dominating the scenario, and he was of the opinion that all nobles, unless and until we have eliminated all nobles and all the clergymen and the nobility, we cannot, purify our country of the evils had that had been our cause. So, which was probably not right. And later on, many people, many historians have rejected that idea. And yes, from my particular locational perspective, if you say, yes, we all hope for a fresh change. We hope for a transformation in social, political, economic orders. But then, after some time, when we find that it's not what we had expected, it's a betrayal of sorts. Then we have to, as citizens, good citizens, all we can do is expect a genuine change next time. What
Amen.
else? I don't know what else to say.
I can just say amen. Yes, there's an important information, if you'd like to share, that is list of few names of books with reference to the historical background of French Revolution.
Um, I haven't prepared any list as such here. I can share one later on, but I have referred to William Doyle. Yeah, I should have done that, but I'm sorry about that. William Doyle's a very short introduction, the Oxford series. There is a brilliant book on the French Revolution. This is by William Doyle. This is a very important one. And the other one that I was talking of was, this is just a minute. This is, yeah, Peter McPhee. Peter McPhee's The French Revolution. And I would, of course, two texts I could not mention: A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, and the other is Carlyle. Carlyle's The French Revolution. These are, must-read texts as far as the French Revolution is concerned. And of course, now there are many other books that have come up. Among the recent books, this was the very short introduction was released in 2001. So that is there, and there are later books that also have been added up to. Actually, I teach Mary Wollstonecraft in my university. So, and I've been teaching Mary Wollstonecraft for some time now. And while dealing with Mary Wollstonecraft, I've been exploring some of these ideas regarding French Revolution. So, thank you. I mean, I got a chance to explore these further and deeper. So anyway, if you want a comprehensive bibliography, I need a little bit more time maybe.
Yeah, you can share it. We have a Telegram group. Most of the members are in the Telegram group, so I can share the list in the Telegram group. The next question is how the Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and Martin Luther Jr.'s speech ignited the American War of Independence, especially the Black Right movement.
Yeah, I saw this question flashing out. Yeah, of course. You see, I won't be able to very critically comment on this at this point of time. But yes, of course, I mean, not only, I mean, these are very well-known events that had ignited the imagination of the American War of Revolution. George Washington had played a very important role. Thomas Jefferson, who had also been an advisor when the this French Declaration of the Rights of Man was being drafted. He was an important father, founding father of the American Revolution. I actually could not speak of all the, as I told, I could not do justice to the American Revolution part because it was slightly more inclined towards the French Revolution. But yes, there were these several, orations that were relevant in the case of America, which had inspired the American citizens towards action.
Thank you. We take the last question of the day. What is your take on the aftermath of French Revolution, especially the Reign of Terror? Can the revolution be said to be unsuccessful?
Okay, I'm not qualified enough to have a take on the success as such of French Revolution, but yes, the way historians have been looking at it, see, success, unsuccessful, these are what should I say? Two obvious kind of statements. I won't go into that. French Revolution is a much way complex event that, as I tried to show, it was a series of events piling up one over the other that led on to this event called the French Revolution. So whether the Reign of Terror, the Reign of Terror, because it involved itself with the Reign of Terror, therefore it becomes unsuccessful, I would not go for such a judgmental kind of conclusion. Many critics and historians have said that, actually Carlyle said in replying to Burke that whereas Burke was in favor of the monarchists and the anti-Jacobins, Carlyle had said that the ancient regime had become rotten in its core and it deserved the fate that it had got. So that was what Carlyle saw in the revolution. And that's it.
Thank you, sir, for such a engaging discussion on some of the very pertinent queries put forward by our participants. Thank you, participants, for your questions.
And thanks to the participants and to your comments. I couldn't read all of those, but
I'll copy it and I'll WhatsApp. I'll copy and I'll WhatsApp the comments to you.
My sincere gratitudes to all of you.
And before we conclude, I would request my co-organizer, Dr. Bashudhara Roy, to please convey her vote of thanks to our honorable speaker today.
Thank you, Sekada. And Professor Samipendra just awed us with his wonderful lecture. And I don't have words to express my gratitude to him because it was so comprehensive, it was so lucid, he took into account the fact that these are areas, which we cover very hurriedly in class, and therefore a thorough explanation of all these critical ideas was very, very important for our listeners. That was the purpose of organizing, this history of ideas, so that the ideas would be clearer for our audiences, and they would be able to critically think on it. And I believe that by offering them a wealth of information on these two aspects, you have done a big justice to the entire series. Thank you so much for your gracious presence, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you,
I am honored.
wonderful
Thank you.
audience. Thank you for being there with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Samipendra. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for delivering such a erudite lecture. Thank you, Basu. And thank you, participants. See you tomorrow again. Take care. Good night. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.